Hello, in this tutorial video I'm going to answer the question, is Ophiuchus a 13th zodiac sign? You may have heard this idea. Astronomers sometimes suggest it, I've heard it from a few astrologers, that there's a 13th sign, there aren't just 12 signs. There is a 13th sign called Ophiuchus, and Ophiuchus is a constellation. And so this brings to mind a related question. Are signs, are zodiac signs, constellations? And if not, what is the relationship between them? And then that sometimes brings up the idea of sidereal astrology, which is based more on the actual stars, and as opposed to the more popular tropical astrology, more popular in the West anyway. In India, a form of sidereal astrology tends to be more popular. But how are all these things related? They're all connected somehow, and can we answer this question, is Ophiuchus a 13th zodiac sign? I'm going to answer all these questions. First question, is Ophiuchus a 13th zodiac sign? No. There's your answer. It's very simple. I don't think there's any way to defend the idea that Ophiuchus is a 13th zodiac sign. And to explain that, we need to understand a little bit about constellations and zodiac signs and understand the relationship between them. Okay. So that's the sky. The sky is a bunch, those are the stars in the sky. That's about half the sky. This image of these brighter stars is taken from a website, artlovelight.com. I always like to give credit to the source of things. That's the full website address. And the stars are most of them are in a band we call the Milky Way, and they're fairly randomly distributed. Because we hear about constellations so often, sometimes people begin to think there are obvious clusters of stars, but it's not so obvious. It's kind of random. So I might take this V and call that a constellation, this kind of a V shape. Or maybe we'll take this, kind of an S shape, make a constellation out of it. I don't know, how about this one over here as a separate constellation? Maybe this will be a separate constellation. Different people are going to connect the stars in different ways. So I just want to make that point clear. And obviously the constellations will have different sizes as we pick different stars to put together. So over time, there's been a fairly agreed upon way of making these pictures by connecting the stars. There have been a lot of variations over time, and it's kind of settled down into a certain grouping. And here's the same image of the stars as in the previous slide, but with the pictures drawn. By pictures, I mean the constellations. So here's Ursa Major, the Great Bear, and it's a very large constellation. So you have all these different constellations, different sizes, different shapes. Some are small, some are big. And here, this dotted light bluish curve is the path of the sun. So every year the path goes through the same constellations. Here is Pisces in this kind of orange box. I've put a box around the names of the constellations that have the same names as the zodiac signs. So there is a constellation called Pisces, and Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, Leo, Virgo. We're looking at about half the sky. And on the next slide, I'll show you the other half. So here's the Pisces constellation, fairly big. Aries is a small constellation. And then here's the constellation Taurus, which is fairly large. And over here is Gemini. Cancer is fairly small. There's a gap between Gemini and Cancer. Also, notice this with Taurus, which extends up to here. And then Gemini begins here. There's a little gap here. And Orion is a large constellation. It reaches up almost right between them. So if we're going to use constellations as the basis of the zodiac, as we follow the sun through the constellations, it goes through constellation Pisces. It doesn't go through the constellation Aries. Aries is a little bit off. So you wouldn't have a constellation Aries unless you felt, well, it's close enough. So my point is that the sun does not go clearly through a set of 12 constellations. What it does is it goes through Pisces, goes a little bit below Aries, spends a long time going through Taurus, then between Taurus and Gemini, it goes almost through the top part of Orion here, goes through Gemini, then there's a little gap, and then there's Cancer, which is fairly small, and then Leo is very large and takes a long time to go through the constellation Leo. So there are constellations with the names Aries, Taurus, Gemini along the path of the sun through the sky, but they vary in size. They sometimes overlap, sometimes there are gaps, and sometimes there are other constellations such as Orion that fall in between the constellations that we usually think of as zodiac signs. So therefore, if we were to use constellations as the basis of astrology, we should have a 13th sign of Orion, because Orion comes right in here close to between Taurus and Gemini. And we also should have double signs for where some of the constellations overlap. And I'll show you some examples of overlap in the next slide where we look at the other 6 signs. So clearly constellations are not the basis of astrology, because we don't talk about the sun being in Orion or being in 2 signs at one time because the constellations overlap. Astrology is just not based on these constellations. Now, what is astrology based on? There are 2 kinds of astrology, tropical astrology and sidereal astrology, and I've shown the tropical astrology signs here in blue. So this section here is Aries. I've got it in blue here, if you notice, and here's Taurus. And this horizontal line is called the celestial equator, and the tropical zodiac is based on a rather abstract idea, which is where the path of the sun, known as the ecliptic plane, crosses the celestial equator, begins the zodiac. So these first 30 degrees are Aries, next 30 are Taurus, next 30 are Gemini, and so on. So he says Cancer. So the odd thing is that the zodiac sign, the tropical zodiac sign Aries, is mostly in the constellation Pisces. So that's a little confusing. And the zodiac sign Taurus is in the constellation of Aries, and a little bit of it is Aries, maybe half, and then the other half is constellation Taurus. So depending on the sign and how big the constellations are, it tends to be about 1 sign backwards. But notice with Taurus, a lot of the constellation Taurus is in Taurus. So the constellations are just not nice little groups of 30 degrees. That's very, very different from the zodiac signs, which are nice groups of 30 degrees. And the other planets, well, we call the sun a planet, even though it's obviously not a planet. Mercury, Venus, Mars, also the moon, they'll travel near the ecliptic plane. They'll be close to the path of the sun, not exactly the same, but they'll wander off. So they'll be in a band very close to this, going through these same constellations. In sidereal astrology, the sign Aries, the sidereal sign Aries, is near the constellation of Aries. And the sign Taurus is near the constellation Taurus. So in sidereal astrology, instead of this being Aries, this would be Pisces. But notice, Aries is a very small constellation, and in the sidereal zodiac, each sign is still 30 degrees. So in sidereal astrology, the constellations are fairly roughly near the signs, but not anywhere close to being an exact match, because the constellations vary in size, overlap, have gaps between them, and so on. Okay, now let's look at the other half of the sky, and here's that path of the sun, and we'll get the same kind of things, where here's the tropical sign Libra, which is near the constellation Virgo. Here's the tropical sign Scorpio, near the constellation Libra. And here's the tropical sign Sagittarius, which is near the constellation of Scorpio. And here's the Ophiuchus. that people make a lot of noise about. And Ophiuchus extends all the way down and reaches down to the ecliptic plane. And that's why some people have said, oh, there's a 13th sign, maybe your planet is in Ophiuchus. But Ophiuchus pretty much overlaps with Scorpio. So, if you're going to have additional signs, as I mentioned before, you should also have a little bit of Orion, as we saw in the previous slide. And you've got the problems of overlaps. Look at Capricorn here. Overlaps with Aquarius. So if we're going to use constellations, if when you were born, the sun or any planet was in this area, if we're using constellations, we should say that it's in Capricorn and Aquarius, because it's in this area where they overlap. And if it's over here in between constellations, then what do? You have no zodiac sign? Well, maybe you would say Aquila falls in between them, and you can make an argument that your sign is in Aquila. So signs are not the same as constellations, and if you were to make a zodiac based on constellations, you would not have a 13th sign called Ophiuchus, because it, for the most part, overlaps with Scorpio. You'd have other signs such as perhaps Aquila, perhaps Orion, as we saw in the previous screen. You'd also have planets in two signs at once. You'd have a very complex system, and it's not as simple as saying, I'm going to pop a 13th sign in there. So this idea that there's a 13th sign called Ophiuchus, it doesn't make any sense. If you're going to have a 13th sign called Ophiuchus, you would also have to have all these other things, overlapping signs, like you're simultaneously Capricorn and Aquarius, and you'd have to have an Orion sign or something, and then you'd have void signs where you're like not in the zodiac, you're in between the signs, or maybe you say it's this. Anyway, you've got a whole complicated system that has nothing to do with the way astrology is practiced. Astrology is not based on constellations. So there is no Ophiuchus. There is no 13th sign Ophiuchus. And if you want to make an argument that there is, then you can have many other signs as well, and all this additional complexity. So that's the real deal with this. This idea that there's a 13th sign just is not true. If there's a 13th sign, then there's probably a 14th, 15th, and 16th sign, and all these other complexities. Okay. Now, the next question that's related to this. But didn't the ancient astrologers use the constellations? This is an argument that some astronomers say, that the zodiac's off by 30 degrees because when astrologers did astrology in ancient times, it was based on the constellations. Well, that's actually not true. These astronomers are no doubt very good astronomers, but they don't know much about history, and they should refer to someone with expertise in the history of astrology to find out. It's not true that the ancient astrology was based on the constellations. So that might seem like what they did in ancient times, but it's actually not true. And here's one of the oldest books in astrology, now known as the Tetrabiblos, the 4 books by Ptolemy. This is in book section 22. Here's a website address for a translation of it. So what Ptolemy said in the 2nd century AD is, it is reasonable to reckon the beginnings of the signs from the equinoxes and solstices, partly because the writers make this quite clear, and particularly because from our previous demonstrations we observed that their natures, powers, and familiarities take their cause from the solstitial and equinoctial starting places, and from no other source. Well, it takes their power from the solstitial and equinoctial starting places is the definition of the tropical zodiac. So Ptolemy makes it very, very clear that the signs are based on the solstices and the equinoxes, which is the tropical zodiac. And he says the writers make this quite clear, so he doesn't invent the idea. It's inherited from ideas way before him. So some of the earliest forms of astrology were tropical. They understood what the tropical zodiac is, and the Tetrabiblos is one of the foundational books in astrology, one of the very ancient classic books that provided a basis that from which astrology evolved. So that idea that the ancient astrology was based on the constellations is not true. Ptolemy was a highly educated person. He understood how this, what the tropical zodiac was. He also understood its relationship to the sidereal, to the stars, because what we call precession of the equinoxes, which is the relationship of the tropical zodiac to the stars, was understood by Hipparchus several hundred years before Ptolemy, and Ptolemy in another one of his books called the Almagest mentions the discovery of precession by Hipparchus. So Ptolemy knew about precession of the equinoxes. It was a well-established concept, and he clearly states that he uses the tropical zodiac. So this was understood in some of the most ancient forms of astrology. So it's very, very clear. Historically, astrologers made it clear that they're not basing their astrology on the constellations or anything resembling the constellations. So that whole idea that astrology has gotten thrown off because it used to be based on the constellations is not true. Now, there are other astrologers in the time of Ptolemy, such as Vettius Valens, who also make reference to the equinoxes. And historian Otto Neugebauer makes this clear. He says the longitudes in Vettius Valens are sidereal longitudes, whereas the later authors operate with tropical longitudes, obviously following the norm adopted by Ptolemy and Theon. So what Neugebauer is saying is that Ptolemy uses the tropical zodiac, some other people use the sidereal zodiac, but Valens is using a sidereal zodiac, not the constellations. The difference being that Valens also uses signs that are 30 degrees in length, perfect 30-degree sections of the sky, which the constellations are not. So in sidereal astrology, also not using the constellations, but using evenly divided circle into 12 equal sizes. So the whole idea of being based on the constellations is not the ancient tradition, and also it was clearly established early on that the zodiac consists of 12 signs of 30 degrees, and the constellations are, as we saw, are nowhere close to being that. Now, so what is the relationship of zodiac signs to constellations? To summarize what I just said, the constellations, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, etc., are near the sidereal signs, Aries, Taurus, Gemini, but each sidereal zodiac sign is 30 degrees in length. Constellations, on the other hand, vary in size, and there are gaps between some of the constellations, and some of the constellations overlap. Now, smaller star groups, not big constellations, but smaller star groups are used in Vedic astrology, for example, but the larger constellations are generally not used. And a problem, by the way, of using these larger constellations, let's go all the way back to our first slide. These stars, we can group them together as a picture, as we do here, but these stars are not necessarily the same distance from us. They're not actually necessarily a group of stars in the sky, because they could vary in distance from us. So even though visually they look like they're close together, maybe this star is very close, maybe this one's very far away. So they're all part of Ursa Major, just because somebody thought that made a nice picture of a bear. That's somewhat arbitrary, but also arbitrary is that they just look like they're closer together to us, and they may be hugely different in their distance from us. So the whole idea of using constellations has lots of problems to it. They're arbitrary. Number one, they're arbitrary pictures. Number two, the stars are not necessarily actually close to each other. Number three, it was never done. So that whole idea that astrology's gotten thrown off because we used to use constellations is not true. Okay. All right, so back to where I was. Excuse me. Last point here on this slide, tropical signs and sidereal signs separate from each other at a rate of 1 degree per 72 years. That's the precession of the equinoxes, which was understood all the way back 100 to 200 years BC, and possibly even earlier than that. That's the first clearly stated example we have of it, understanding of it by Hipparchus. So all this was understood, and it was clear that people chose a sidereal or a tropical zodiac and not the constellations. Now this leads to our final question: which is better, tropical astrology or sidereal astrology? Tropical astrology is based on the equinoxes and solstices. Sidereal astrology has the signs near the constellations. They're nowhere close to being identical because, as I said, in sidereal astrology each sign is exactly 30 degrees. So which one is better? Well, Ptolemy said tropical astrology is better. He said it works better. And this is an ancient tradition of basing this astrology on the equinoxes and solstices. So it depends on who you talk to. Now, I use tropical astrology, but I don't think zodiac signs are the most important thing in the world. I think aspect patterns are far more powerful, and the aspect patterns don't depend on which zodiac you're using because they're just the aspect patterns, the distances between the planets. Now, other astrologers use the sidereal zodiac. In India, the most popular forms of astrology use the sidereal zodiac. So different people have different experiences. And this leads to another question. When we say which is better, tropical astrology or sidereal astrology, how do we know which is better? What most people do is they use their personal experience. Another way you would know would be controlled research. In the 21st century, in modern times, when we want to know if something works, we expect people to do more rigorous and controlled research. Personally, I think rigorous, controlled research is extremely important. I don't think we should trust just personal experience. Our personal experience and the controlled research should confirm each other. I think most astrologers rely almost strictly on their personal experience and the theory and concepts that they're based on, and they're not as enthusiastic as I am about the importance of controlled research. So if you're talking to most astrologers, they're going to tell you based on the tradition that they learned, their personal experience, the personal experience of their colleagues and their teachers, and they will tell you what they think based on that. I have a series of videos that I'm making on the extreme case sampling studies that we do on the tropical zodiac signs, which confirms that they have, well, I don't know if I should say confirms, but it suggests that the zodiac signs do have some significance, not as powerful and obvious as what most astrologers think, but that they do have some real significance in our lives. I believe that's my last slide. Yes, it is. So that's the answer to our question. Is Ophiuchus a 13th zodiac sign? No, it isn't. And in answering that question, I hope I've clarified some points about the relationship of the constellations to the sidereal zodiac and the tropical zodiac. Thank you very much for listening. God bless. Namaste.